So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Jamie Stanziano, Senior Vice President and Client Officer for Ipsos in the US. Jamie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Appreciate the intro, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session on sports and sports fandom in America. My name is Jamie Stanziano. I help look after the media and entertainment space at Ipsos in the US. We're really excited for you to join us today. We have some research to share from the Ipsos polling division represented here today by Mallory Newell and Johnny Sawyer. We also have several of our partners from across the industry as well to participate in a panel discussion after that that we're very pumped to share with you as well. Different perspectives all around the trajectory and the landscape of the sports industry and what that means for many different aspects of the ecosystem. We have Elisa Padilla, Chief Marketing Officer of the New York Red Bulls for Major League Soccer. We have Edwin Roman, Senior Director of Insights at ESPN. Under the Walt Disney Company. And last but not least, we have Johnny Sonkin, EVP Marketing and Operations at Front Office Sports. So with that said, let me turn it over to my colleague, Mallory, who will take you through some of our research in this space before we move into the panel. Mallory?
Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. I am excited to be here, and my hope is that we can keep the kind of data intro short, so we leave as much time for discussion and for questions as possible. As Jamie mentioned, I'm one of the leads of Ipsos's public polling practice, and one of the most exciting things about the work that myself, Johnny Sawyer, and my team do is really utilize research to understand trends in public opinion and to try and figure out how data can be a resource for brands and companies and the public writ large. So this all started because a couple years ago, Johnny and I and some of our teammates were kind of kicking around this notion of, what do you wish that there is like reliable trend data on topics that Americans care about, but it's not necessarily easy to find or all in one place. And really the first topic that came to mind for us was sports and the very broad umbrella that encapsulates sports research. As we're here to discuss today, the sports landscape, whether you're talking about collegiate or professional sports, is just rapidly changing. So we have now 2 years worth of survey research under our belt, where we are seeking to understand Americans' attitudes towards sports, from the sports that they like watching, the sports that they actually play, and how they interact with sports. And then here, as we're trying to discuss today, what it all means for the world around us. So Johnny and I will briefly take you through a presentation of some of the highlights from our data earlier this year. Johnny, if you want to skip to the next slide, please. I'll start off with a little bit about how people watch, how people consume sports, and then the fan experience. And then Johnny will kind of walk through some of the implications. Great, now we're in business. All right, next slide. So overall, roughly 2/3 of Americans consider themselves to be fans of sports. And we don't really just ask this as yes or no, but it really is, what sports do you consider yourself to be fans of? And they can choose as many or as few that apply. One thing that is interesting, we saw it both a year ago and in our data today, is that there's actually an age gap here, where Americans under 35 are less likely than older Americans to cite a specific sport that they consider themselves to be fans of. Next slide. Now, what are people fans of? What are they tuning in on? NFL football, is considered to be kind of the leading sport that most Americans pay attention to, followed by baseball, collegiate football, basketball. There's a little bit of a difference where younger Americans are a little bit more diverse in their fandom, right? You see kind of an even split between baseball, college football, basketball. There's a little bit less of a gap between kind of football and everything else. So younger fans, though they're not as perhaps dominant in the fandom area, Americans are kind of starting to show a little bit of signs of tuning into different sports or just having more varied fandom. With older Americans, you see a little bit more coalescing around the NFL. And then you see, for example, people who are ages 55 and up are less likely to cite that they're fans of professional basketball than younger Americans. They are more likely to say that they are fans of golf compared to younger Americans. So there's some differences that do exist, particularly when you unpack fandom by age. Next slide. So there's a number of ways that we all interact with sports, from just how we consume content to who we're following on social media, how we're tuning in, but also going to a sporting event. And what we found is that actually attending a live sporting event is not the main way that people are consuming sports today. About 3 in 10 Americans, or about 4 in 10 sports fans, say that they actually attended a live sporting event last year. Next slide. Now, one of the things, when you compare our data year over year, and again, we just have 2 points in time right now, planning to revisit this and build on it every year. But one of the few things that has changed in our data is the growth in women's sports. I just want to call out Jamie, who is wearing a shirt that actually, if you couldn't tell, said everyone watches women's sports in French. So a little bit of a nod to that right here on our own panel. In just 1 year, there was a 7 percentage point jump in Americans that agreed with the statement, "I would like to see more coverage of women's sports." You see a similar pattern emerge under sports fans themselves, and now a majority agree with that statement. When you look at this by demographic group, it's happening across the board with both men and women. This is among all Americans, not those that necessarily consider themselves to be fans. But that biggest gap in terms of, or the biggest jump rather, in terms of age is among that age 35 to 54 cohort. So they're the ones that are primarily driving this increase in excitement and enthusiasm around at least wanting to see more coverage about women's sports. Though a lot of things in our data, from fandom to betting habits to sports that you play, have kind of remained flat year over year, this is one where we have seen an increase in enthusiasm. And then moving on, I'm going to turn it over to Johnny Sawyer, my colleague, who is going to unpack about the landscape and what this all means. Johnny, over to you.
Thanks, Meller. And so just as we start to get into the changing landscape of sports, so kind of the one thing to kind of kick us off is that, Americans don't, sorry, so Americans really aren't that familiar with sort of recent developments in the sports world. Whether that is when we look sort of in college athletics, as far as, the Big Ten, SEC forming super conferences, or whether that's, the transfer portal in college athletics, or whether that is, ESPN and Fox or Warner Bros, announcing plans to launch a joint sports streaming platform. Generally Americans are not fully aware or familiar, about what's really going on in the sports world. And, kind of keeping on the topic of consumption, one thing that sports fans are looking to do is to simplify their content consumption. So about 2 in 3 sports fans and, those that play sports, they agree that, currently there's just too many separate platforms that are needed to watch sports. And then when we did ask them, as far as, would they support, a streaming package that does bundle multiple streaming platforms, just a bare majority of, both sports fans and those that play sports, would support that. And I think it kind of drives home, as we, as Melly mentioned earlier, the way that most people watch sports is not, going to live sporting events. And so they are looking to get their sports fix in many different ways. And this is one of the ways that they're looking at. Now, if one of the bigger changes in the sports landscape, within the last, 5 or so years is the legalization of sports betting. And what we found, through our research is that Americans largely do support sports betting. About 3 in 5 Americans and sports fans say that people should be able to gamble on sports and spend their money how they want. However, while they do support sports betting, concerns do exist about the integrity of the game. Especially I think we've seen in recent years, scandals around, players being suspended for sports betting and things of that nature. And what we do find is that about 2 in 5 Americans and sports fans, they do think that sports betting lessens the integrity of the game. So, there are kind of two sides to the coin there. And kind of finally, just, along with sports betting, one of the bigger topics in the landscape of sports lately has been, the use of allowing college athletes to be paid money for, their name, their image, and their likeness. And, what we do see is that a majority of, both Americans and sports fans do, support this. And, when we do break that down by different demographics, this is especially popular around with Black Americans, with Americans under 55, and then, kind of with Democrats and independents. But all in all, it is still a majority of Americans, that do support this. And kind of along those lines, a majority agree that colleges should guide athletes through NIL. And we do see, across demographics here, much more, uniform support, especially, among age groups. While those under age 55 are a little less likely to support NIL, they do think, if it is going to be there, that, colleges should guide athletes through NIL. And, just, I know this is just a snapshot into our research, that there's much more that we dove into. And kind of with that, I will hand it back over to Mallory and to welcome in our panelists and start the discussion.
Thanks, Johnny. And as Jamie alluded to at the beginning of our webinar, we are thrilled to welcome some experts in the field who come from a wide-ranging background, from broadcast to professional sports to the intersection of journalism and content consumption online, and even my colleague, a former collegiate athlete himself. So thank you all for being here today. I want to kick off our discussion today. And, this is kind of a broad question, but I think it helps ground us in, all of the different topic areas that Johnny and I just touched on. For you personally, what do you see as the biggest change in the sports landscape? And it can be either collegiate or professional. Johnny Sawyer, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll open it up to our panelists.
So I think the biggest change has really been in looking at college sports and, the use of NIL. I'm thinking back to when I graduated college around 2019, which is just pre-NIL. Things were just so much different. The rules were so much stricter, and now kind of looking at where things are at, things are really in the wild, wild west. On one hand, it is, the players being able to, capitalize off of their name, image, and likeness is definitely a step up from where things were. At the same time, nobody really knows what the rules are. News that broke today, with UNLV, their starting quarterbacks, he, decided he's going to transfer and use his red shirt, and he says that UNLV didn't pay what he was owed. UNLV says that they did, and no matter what side is true, what ends up happening is someone ends up getting hurt. Who really ends up getting hurt is the fan, because this is the best UNLV season in a while. And, I think that's where, fans are kind of at. I think they support NIL, but we also see that the majority also think that college sports is just about making money now. And so there's the conflict there. And, I think really the next step in college sports is to figure that out, because despite all the kind of problems that there are, college sports has arguably never been popular. You look at college football, the national championship and the semifinals last year, 25 million people watched. You look at women's basketball, the championship game last year had, almost 20 million viewers. You even look at women's volleyball, they're showing record viewership. So even with all the problems with college sports, it is in a good spot, but, those are things that, as the landscape is rapidly changing, that do need to be ironed out.
Definitely, and thanks for sharing that perspective. Edwin, you want to be our first panelist to jump in here?
Yeah,
In your
happy-
opinion, what is the biggest change in the current landscape right now that you see?
Yeah, well, change is certainly indicative of what's happening in the landscape overall. I think there's a lot of things, but I think one that stands out for me is just the amount of access that sports fans have today, which can be a gift and a curse to a certain degree, right? Recognizing that there's so many options, but when you think about all the different platforms that exist, from traditional TV to podcasting and digital and social media, there's so many ways to express your fandom. And so for me, that is certainly something that creates, great opportunity, not just for fans themselves, but the people that are trying to serve sports fans. I know from our vantage point, our company mission is to serve sports fans anytime and anywhere. So this kind of feeds directly into sort of like the DNA of what ESPN tries to represent. So I think the challenge, which we can turn into an opportunity, is thinking about how do we make sure we're maximizing those different distribution points and providing content that's speaking to fans when they want it and how they want it.
I really like that. I can jump in next because it kind of builds on the access point that Edwin just laid out for you guys. I mean, look, the question has multiple answers to it. It's hard to give you the biggest, right? But for me, I think it's the emergence of new leagues and new properties beyond the big four or the big five, depending on where your fandom lies. Right, but pickleball and padel and volleyball, like Edwin mentioned, right? It ties back to access to me, because we're now able to serve content to the consumer where they want it, when they want it, around whatever sport they're passionate about, right? So I think those two things go hand in hand, because it's not just about the traditional stick and ball sports and big four, right? And football and NFL and NBA and MLB and NHL. So I think we're going to continue to see new sports pop up. You look at the Olympics, right? Breakdancing is now an Olympic sport. So you're going to continue to see new sports kind of become mainstream and have their moment. And it's going to take them time to catch up. But I think what's most interesting is that there's a place for them. Right? They don't have to be one of the big leagues with a massive media rights deal, right? Because we can serve content to the consumer anytime, anywhere, because of the access that Edwin mentioned.
Yeah, and going on the thread of access and content development, I mean, you first had, your TV, then you went to a computer screen, now you're on a mobile screen, and it feels like there continues to be more screens, even though, you can now watch it on any size screen. So I think that meeting fans where they are, I think, is the biggest change that I have seen, because, working for a professional sports team, we literally need to think through consumer habits to really know how are we going to, reach the casual sports fan, the soccer mom, the soccer dad, versus the soccer enthusiast. And because there's so much there's so much access out there that our challenge is, right, how do we reach them where they are to get them to come to our matches where they don't necessarily look, they can consume on, Apple TV through MLS Plus, they can, follow what's happening on Twitter, they can follow the storylines, on Instagram. It's all just about meeting the fans where they are. I think that's been the biggest change that I have seen.
Yeah, that's great, Elisa. And to just kind of put it in perspective, Johnny, you mentioned pickleball, for example. And I mean, our data shows that 6% of Americans say that they played it last year. It doesn't seem like a lot, and it was not a significant change from the year before, but if you kind of look at that for the American public, that's like 14, 15 million people. Like there's a lot of fans that are sort of up for grabs and wanting to get their fix. And I think it's really interesting just to see how the landscape has completely diversified. There's a couple of different directions I think that we can take this discussion, but I'm gonna piggyback on something that you just said, Elisa. So I'll start with you, but I think the question here is, we see in our data that fans feel that in some instances attending live events is really cost prohibitive, right? And we know that 3 in 10 Americans, that's something that they did. So that's not a majority, but it certainly is a sizable number. But I think more broadly than that, how do you and how can brands show up in the many different places that fans are, right? If they're not attending live events, how do they get their sports fix? How can we meet them where they are?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of a few things, right? So when social media emerged a few years ago, that changed the total landscape of media, right? It affected print, it affected television, it affected radio. So I think that if you take the 360 approach and you think about your brand and getting your messaging out there and understand the consumer life cycle, I think that's the starting point, right? Data should drive every marketing decision that brands and sports teams, how they activate their brand. And I think that for us, we really take a deep dive into understanding who our primary ticket buyers are, right? Who our secondary ticket buyers are, and then where is the area of opportunity to reach those that perhaps live not, don't want to come out to New Jersey or who don't have access to the path, but are still interested in our brand. So we think about social media. We think about how do we get the players out in the community, right? Again, whether it's through camps, whether it's through clinics. We also look at field marketing, like where are cultural events that make sense for us to be at? Because I think that one-to-one connection with the consumer is so much more important than running, a spot on OTT or running, a spot on a podcast. Those are equally as important, but I think that when you show up as a brand, specifically at the grassroots level, and you meet your fans or potential fans where they are in their neighborhood, in their setting, I think that resonates a lot more, and you're going to go from back of mind to top of mind. And I just want to make a comment about pickleball. One of the reasons that I feel that pickleball is so popular is because it's so accessible. I mean, literally in the financial district in New York City, there is a pickleball court on the side of a Dwayne Reed, which I would have never thought that you would see a pickleball court like in the middle of, a busy street on Water Street. But I think that's the popularity of the sport and having access to it is really, really something that, other leagues coming up should take note of.
But it's for everybody, right? And you can, I'm sure, Mallory and Johnny, you guys see it in the data, right? When you look at who's playing pickleball, you've got, young kids who are learning it from the ground up, grassroots level, all the way to people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So I've seen some data that, is showing pickleball and the trajectory, and it's on outpacing participation of tennis and golf, right? And those two sports, I'd say golf more so, are the easiest to compare from an age range standpoint, but it goes back to, you know, everybody being able to play it, whether you're a casual player, an avid player, or somewhere in between. So it's really interesting to see. And, you know, look, everything is fueled by money too. So when you think about it from a league perspective, you know, and sponsors and advertisers in those dollars, what's most interesting to me is that those emerging leagues is where you have many times the strongest engagement, right? Because if those fans of pickleball, as the example, to be able to reach them, they're much more engaged than a casual fan amongst a sea of casual fans elsewhere. So I think it's sort of this really interesting inflection point where emerging leagues are going to continue to grow and advance and have their moment, and more dollars are going to start being allocated towards those emerging properties.
I would say, like, that's the beauty of sports, that it's being democratized, right? That it literally is for everyone. And to your question, Mallory, like, we know there's a lot of value in the live game experience, but we also know that people have the benefit of 65-inch screens also in their homes, right? And so they're able to replicate that same experience. But I think what we also try to understand are what the underlying motivations are for how you consume or how you connect, whether it's in person or whether it's at home. And sports has always been communal, right? And so community is a big piece of it. And I think, again, going back to even the access point, we have the ability to create in-person physical community by being at a game. Like, I was at the Met game last Thursday, and just hearing the roar of the crowd, like, that gets me passionate and gets me amped up about, you know, my sports team, but also recognizing that you can simulate and create a lot of that community in a virtual way. So I could literally be in a Zoom box, you know, in one part of the country, connecting to somebody else in another part of the country. So there's different ways of expressing our fandom that go from in-person to virtual, and really exploiting that entire spectrum, I think, is the beauty of what we get to do in terms of sports.
So something else I wanted to follow up on is just I mean, we've talked about growth across the board, but no place is that more evident than the growth and interest in women's sports. I want to spend some time on that. For you all, you know, do you see the velocity in women's sports continuing over time? And what does that look like? Right? How do we go from, you know, an increase in, I would like to see more coverage in women's sports, to other ways of measuring growth?
I'll jump in
Go
first.
to one of my Johnnies. Okay, go ahead, Edwin. Yeah,
Well, I'm happy to see one of the Johnnies as well.
go for it. You take it.
I think one of the interesting things about women's sports is always the chicken or egg thing, right? Like, which came first? And I think that the interest has always been there. I think what's happening now collectively, thanks to the industry at large, is that, like, that fandom is being nurtured, right? There's more exposure, there's more opportunity for women's sports. I know even on our own networks, like, you know, the WNBA season had its most highest rated, you know, season ever, regular season ever, and that's terrific. And I think that's just a testament of where things are headed. But I do think this is something that's sustained, because it's not something that just happened. It's been in the works for a long time, and I think we're starting to see the fruit of a lot of hard work across the industry starting to sort of like come about now. I think the other thing is that, you know, it's not literally just what people are doing, but I think there's a change in sentiment as well. So even in our own data, we're seeing interest increase, and it's actually across, you know, all demographic groups, which is similar to what you had shown on your slide, and I think that's part of it. And then for us, it's understanding, all right, so what's driving that sustainability? And what we've heard from fans is that there's a head and heart factor when it comes to women's sports. And so fans are more likely to say that, you know, the women's games are more technical and strategic, or they play with more passion and heart. And I think that balance is kind of what's driving, like, the magic behind it. But I think that in itself is going to be core to the DNA moving forward of women's sports, and why it's not a fad, and certainly a trend that's here to stay.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think we're only just starting to scratch the surface. Look, to the point you made earlier, the product's been there, right? It's not like this is new. I think it's not just about what's happening inside the lines, but it's about what's happening outside the lines, right? And support from all sides. You know, especially on the people that put the events on, right? And back to access, not to keep hitting that over the head, but we at Front Office Sports, just a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Tony Godsick, who is well known as Roger Federer's agent for the last 20 years. But, Tony has represented male and female tennis players and stars for a long time. He made a comment about how, in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, the US Open would be on, but in the players, if you weren't a star player, you didn't get noticed because you were nowhere to be found unless you were at the event. You had to make it to the semifinals or the finals to have your moment and be seen. So I think it goes back again to access, is like, look at Script Sports and everything that they're doing, and regional sports networks. And again, back to personalized content and delivering content to people at the click of a finger. It's the people that are enabling the athletes to be seen that will continue to drive women's sports forward. So yeah, look, I think we're only scratching the surface. And again, back to emerging leagues too. Look at, Brianna Stewart and what she's doing with Unrivaled and creating a new sports property with a different format, a 3-on-3 format that has not been done before. Granted, now 3-on-3 is also an Olympic sport. So it's just a snowball effect, and it's going to keep growing. And I'm personally, we're really excited to continue to promote and amplify everything that happens in and around women's sports. But it's not just women's sports; it's women in sports. That's the key.
And I think it also helps. You know that a lot of the or some of the stars from women's sports also come from kind of non-coastal places. Obviously like the biggest one being Caitlin Clark, for being from Iowa. Or if you look at obviously UConn women's basketball, throughout the 2000s and 2010s, they really helped raise the level of everyone. And the fact that because those or because women's sports kind of does a really good job of representing all of America, someone could turn on a game and no matter where they're from, they can see someone that looks like them. They can see someone that represents them, and it helps, draw them into the story. It helps them want to follow. It helps get them into whatever sport it is. And so I think the fact that, I think the fact that we're able to represent all America with women's sports is definitely going to continue to push it forward.
The other thing that I'll say is that
Yeah,
I definitely, oh, sorry, Mallory, what I was going to say was I definitely think that the growth, we're just scratching the surface, like, one of my fellow panelists said before. And I think that what's most interesting is that now you actually have little girls, who probably never thought they could play a sport. Now they can turn on the TV or they can go on social media and they can see someone that they can aspire to be. And I think that that's really important because I just know, coming from, a Latina background, when I was growing up, girls in my household weren't allowed to play sports, right? So it was only my brothers, right? So now I look at my nieces who are growing up in a totally different environment than the environment that I grew up in, and they see folks that look like them on TV or on social media. So I think that we're just getting started.
Absolutely. And I was that girl, right? I had a Detroit Shock jersey during their inaugural season when I was growing up. And we have something in our data, like Edwin, I love what you said about sports is community. And if we can tap into that, if brands can figure out how to tap into that, that's really powerful. We have a data point in our survey that shows that a bare majority of fans say that they are fans of a certain team because their family was and they grew up watching them, right? And I think now we're at this inflection point with women's sports, which, Elisa, like you said, you know, young women and girls can see themselves, whether it's on a screen, whether it's on social media, however they're consuming content, which is where I want to go next. I think that's a really, really interesting thing. We had a question from one of our attendees, and this is something that I wanted to touch on as well, right? We know that younger people are sort of more likely to be that casual fan, right? They indicate in our survey data that they're less likely to maybe say that they're fans of a sport. They might be consuming sports a little bit differently. So how about the opportunity to reach more younger emerging fans? Specifically, somebody who differs from like the most passionate fan, but are still kind of looking to consume content or sort of spend money on fandom, right? How can media companies and brands ensure that you break through the clutter to get the attention of younger fans, of casual? And then I'm going to build on that. How do you get them to stay engaged?
I'll say, like, this is probably one of the most fundamental questions, right? Because you need to generate that continuous pipeline of sports fans. And I think the one thing that we have to acknowledge is that younger fans in particular are fanning differently. And so in our collective work, what we found is that for them, they take pride in the fact that they have multiple passions, and we call it a portfolio of passions. So we're living in this and world where I am a sports fan, but I am also a musician, or I am also an artist. And so I think if we can recognize sort of like those intersectional identities and integrate it into what we do, I think that's a bigger part of serving sports fans. So although I work for a sports media company, I think we're trying to think bigger in terms of what sports represents and how it's a bigger part of life. And even how we reflect that in how we cover athletes and teams. I think this point was raised before as well, is like, it's not just what's happening on the field or on the court, but trying to think about the athletes, not just as athletes, but as people. And to me, that's something that helps make that connection point for younger fans who are identifying and can go directly to the source when they want to like understand and better relate to some of the athletes that they follow.
Yeah, there's so many parallels between what ESPN does and what we do at Front Office Sports, and that's what makes our relationship so great and unique, and we support each other all the time. Yeah, it's the convergence of passion points. Sports is a lifestyle. It's a universal language. So we have to play into that lifestyle, and it's not the only thing that people care about, right? So while ESPN, you know, very much focuses on a lot of the same things that we focus on, right? Our proposition from an athlete perspective is athletes want to be business people, and business people are inspired by athletes. So the business of sports is a mainstream subject. We've been at the business of sports for 6 years now, 10 years as a brand, 6 years as a commercial business. So if we can do athlete storytelling from the lens of a business person, we're going to be able to attract a consumer because they sit here, athletes that is, and have conversations just like we're having right now, right? They don't just play in front of tens of thousands of fans on the bright lights in prime time on TV. So, and the athlete profile and athlete marketing and all those things, that's changing faster than anything, to Johnny Sawyer's point before about NIL. You know, and again, it's not just about the big college football player that's hitting the transfer portal because he got a $2 million check, right? It's the field hockey players, and the volleyball players, and the swimmers, and the student athletes that have to make their own way in a very complex NIL world to start their careers from a business perspective way earlier than they ever have.
I'll say that in regards to reaching the younger audience, I think it's an intersection of sport and culture, right? Because, you know, it's lifestyle is one part of it, but we know that the younger generation really cares about giving back, right? So how is your local sports team or the leagues, how are they giving back to resonate, to show up, you know, in the charitable space, where potentially those that are, you know, on the fringe or are sport, you know, of sport or of any sport are going to have that touch point. So I really, really think it's, again, just understanding the younger generation's values and how you show up where they are and meet them where they are.
And kind of just to tie a bow on that, I also think it's, you know, kind of understanding what they are fans of. You know, a lot of younger people are, you know, specifically thinking about team sports, a lot of younger people are player fans, right? Like they have players that they follow. You know, just think about how many people, you know, in the last 20 years have followed LeBron James, you know, wherever he goes. Or if you look at soccer, how many people are Ronaldo or Messi or Neymar fans. So, you know, it's not just that, you know, people, you know, their kids, you know, they got their team, you know, now they also have their players, and they have even more ways, you know, with social media, or, you know, if you look at the amount of athletes that have their own podcasts, for instance, right? Like they have so many ways to also meet their favorite athletes and hear from them. So I also think, you know, for, you know, for and understanding what younger fans want, I think, you know, that's also another dynamic that, you know, kind of has to be considered.
Absolutely. And, you know, as much as we talk about the evolving landscape and growth in a number of different directions, you know, I think we kind of have to give a nod to the, you know, the history that is wrapped up in fandom, right? Not just you're a fan because your family was, or that's how you grew up, right? For better or for worse. Chicago Bears fan here, for worse. But you know, Johnny Sawyer, there's a point in our data that I'd love for you to unpack, and then maybe our panelists can expand upon this a little bit. Sports fans themselves are split on something, and that's the necessity to maintain tradition in sports. Roughly half feel that maintaining tradition in sports is more important than modernizing or keeping with the times. So I guess the question one is, what do we make of that? And two, in this landscape where there is a lot of rapid change, what do we do about that?
So I think, and I think a lot, I think you probably, you know, when it comes to tradition, I think you kind of see a lot of that, definitely among college fans. I mean, I don't think I personally will ever used to seeing Cal and Stanford in the ACC. You know, it's different, and you know, I think because when you grow up with something, and you know, it's always been that way, you kind of resist the change because you think, you know, that's the best way. I think as things start to evolve, I think, you know, one thing, whether it's, you know, leagues or companies, I think, you know, they need to make sure that while change is good, you know, sometimes it is good to just um, keep things the same, whether that is rivalries in sports, you know, whether that is or even if it's something as simple as, you know, hey, like we have these very, very classic uniforms, i.e. the Yankees or something like that, and changing, you know, you feel like you're losing something. So, you know, I understand where fans are coming from. I'd probably be one of those fans that would say, you know, I would want to maintain tradition too. And, you know, there's a fine balance. And, you know, I think as we look forward in the next 10 to 15 years, I think figuring out what that balance is definitely going to be important, because you definitely don't want to lose some of the things that make sports great, but you do want to keep up with the times.
And I'll reinforce that point, because I think, you know, one of the things that we realize is that I just lost my train of thought. I was going to piggyback on a point you were saying, Johnny. I apologize. All right, I lost it. Sorry about that. Oh, so we get to jump in there. Maybe I'll jump off of Johnny.
Yeah, look, I can jump in on the other Johnny's last point. There is, yeah, I'm a Syracuse guy. I went to school in, you know, Syracuse was Big East, and we had Georgetown and UConn, and now they're in the ACC, and they've been in the ACC for a number of years. Look, I think change is necessary. at the speed at which culture moves, the sport's got to move with it, right? The fans have to move with it. You know, today's world, digital world, you know, we're constantly moving, we're constantly looking for more, we're constantly looking to do multiple things at once, right? So change is inevitable. I think the most important thing as it relates to tradition is it's up to us as people that work in the business, but also the governing bodies, the teams, the players, to make sure that the traditions that have been in place for a long time continue to live on, and that is education, right? So we've got to continue to educate, and the NFL did an amazing job the last couple of years, specifically as they celebrated, you know, their 100-year anniversary, and they had the Super Bowl commercials and, you know, all of those things. Nissan does a great job with Heisman House and making sure that the people that have won the Heisman Trophy 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they're relevant because they're in their advertising. So I think it's up to us across the business to educate people on what those traditions are, but also embrace the change that comes, right? Back to Syracuse, we played Stanford last weekend in the ACC, the Atlantic Coastal Conference. It doesn't make sense, but we've got to embrace it because it's going to change again. It's just a matter of time.
Like
Yeah,
13. Oh, sorry. Lisa.
No,
I'm
go ahead,
sorry.
Edwin, go ahead. Get back on. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was gonna just piggyback off of my teammate who gave me the assist there. I appreciate that. I was just gonna say, like, you know, I've been at ESPN for 20 years, and I think when we study sports, one of the things that we know is that regardless of how much change is happening, like those intrinsic motivations for why people come to sport is still the same, right? And that's, I think, the part that we want to maintain, right? Those are some of the traditional things that I think make sports great. But to Johnny's point is we need to recognize that change is sometimes a necessary part of adapting to the world that we're in. I'm a huge baseball fan. I mentioned my Mets allegiance a few minutes ago. And I think one of the things that baseball has done is recognize that the pace of play needed to evolve, right? Because we live in a very different environment. And so they have still upheld the traditions that make baseball like, you know, one of America's like best pastimes, but understanding that like people are on a different internal clock. And so if we can reflect that change in society, we can better maintain the fans we have while also trying to nurture those fans of the future. So sorry to cut you off, Elisa.
No, that's okay. One word that you used that I was going to, you know, start off with my comment is it's evolving, right? Change, there's change and you have to evolve, right? So intrinsically, you're keeping the tradition of baseball, of football, of, you know, whatever your brand essence is, but how are you continuing to evolve as your customers and your fans are changing? They're getting older, right? And those that are aging out, you know, how are you, you know, evoking that emotion and creating that fandom with the up and comers, or however, you know, whatever life cycle it is. I just think that it's all about evolving and just keeping up with the times.
So with a few minutes left, we've got one question in from an attendee, and I'll try and cover a few others that we can in our remaining time. But Elisa, I think you might be well positioned to answer this one. Can you please comment on current trends for live event attendance? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that from an overall, you know, when you look at the top four, specifically, you know, the NFL and baseball and even soccer, I think the attendance in live events is actually growing. People are going back to, you know, arenas and stadiums because it's a sense of community. It's a sense of sharing a passion and seeing things live. So I still, while, you know, consumers still have multiple screens where they can consume their, you know, their sports, their favorite sports team, or, you know, their favorite athlete, I think that they're still going into stadiums because there's nothing like having an arena, you know, hot dog or, you know, a flat beer or, you know, popcorn. I think that there's just, you can't replace that experience, right? Of just walking and having, you know, your digital ticket and going in and, you know, cheering on for, you know, your favorite team or your favorite athlete. And, you know, when I think about the numbers that the Indiana Fever have reached, I mean, it's been crazy with Caitlin Clark, obviously, right? But just this past weekend, I was watching the Connecticut Sun play the Indiana Fever, which is, you know, an arena that I've attended many times, and there was not, and I was watching it on TV, there was not one empty seat in that arena. And again, it goes back to, you know, how people are now becoming more interested. So I think that you can't replace that excitement of being at a sporting event live in person. So definitely on the trending up.
And I think if you think about the old adage of like, you don't really miss something till you lose it. And if you kind of rewind a couple of years ago, what happened in 2020 where we had no sports, interesting sort of time period where like we were sports deprived, and you really understood like what sports meant. And we did a lot of research around that period because again, it was a really unique point in our country's history. But I think to Elisa's point, what you're seeing now is like the ability to go and reconnect with people in person. There was almost a pent up demand, right? To get out of, you know, the Zoom screens and get back and talk with people and touch fans in a, you know, in a very real way. And I think that's the byproduct of, you know, accelerations that were in the making post pandemic.
I think it's also going back to the question about, you know, the casual sports fan or the younger sports fan. If you're someone young, or just kind of dipping your toe into sports or just tagging along with a group of friends and someone takes you to a game, you know, that has the potential to kind of create that core memory and fan base that you can build from. I say this as someone that took their daughter to her first college football game a couple of weeks ago. So this question, I think, is actually a good one to wrap up on. What is the next sport or the next big thing that you all see coming when you think about the future of our sports landscape? Love to hear from everyone on this.
Lisa's gonna like my answer. It's soccer. World Cup 2026. You know, look, the next decade of global sports in North America is massive, right? You've got World Cup, you've got LA 2028, you've got Winter Olympics coming back to Salt Lake. You have new events popping up. You have, you know, leagues like La Liga, you know, bringing regular season matches to the United States for the first time ever, right? Like the lead up to 26 is going to be massive. We have brands that are reaching out to us now for the last 3 months asking, what are you guys doing for World Cup? I know it's 24 months from now, but what are you doing? Right? And it's this buildup that we're going to see over the course of the next 24 months, a little bit less than that now, but leading up to the World Cup is that, look, that's going to put soccer on the map in a way bigger way than it's ever been, specifically in North America. You know, you have, you may not like this part, but Liga MX as an alternative to MLS, right? Like people don't realize that is the most watched sports league in the world. And it happens in North America. So I think brands, advertisers, athletes, fans, everybody, in my opinion, is going to get behind soccer in a very, very big way. As it makes its way through the United States, Mexico, Canada, leading up to World Cup 24 or World Cup 26. Sorry.
Mallory, he said it for me, so I'll toss it over to Edwin.
Love it.
I would just triple on that one, but like I think the globalization obviously is a really key thing here, right? When we think about, we were talking about America's pastime, but think about the global pastime and really is soccer. So I'll give a third nod to that. But just try to vary it a little bit. I know we talked a little bit about sports betting. I think there's certainly some momentum there. And for us, it's just thinking about what are those things that are natural extensions of sports fandom, and again, trying to represent that new facet. And so that might be, you know, another thing I'll add, but I'll again triple and quadruple down on the value and the beauty of soccer.
I think
Thank you,
I probably also,
Vincent.
yeah,
Thank
I'd
you.
also probably also say soccer, but I think, you know, kind of a non-soccer thing. I mean, I think the WNBA is kind of primed to in the next about 10 years to really take a lead. Not only just, you know, kind of with this rookie class, you know, they're adding 3 to 4 new teams in the next couple of years. You know, they're now the WNBA is on, you know, they're on CBS. You know, ESPN is obviously invested heavily in. But not only that, you have in college, you have kind of a next wave of stars that are coming in, and people know them because, you know, of what's happened in the last about 3 years. So I think the WNBA is kind of, you know, by 2030, I think we're going to see a big leap there, and I think, you know, I think it's exciting time for the league.
Great. I want to extend my sincere gratitude to our panelists, to my colleague, Johnny, all of you for joining us today. I love, you know, as a researcher, I love when data can help not only tell a story, but really sort of inform insights and make it practical for all those involved. So thank you so much for joining this Ipsos webinar. This data is public on our website and it's available to access. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And thank you again. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.